Ever had fake cops break into your house to plant evidence? Hit that like button if you think entitled HOA dictators deserve their own reality show called Stupid Criminals, and comment if you've ever wanted to see someone's intimidation tactics backfire spectacularly. So, welcome to the neighborhood mafia. Moving to Willowbrook Estates seemed like the perfect escape from city life. Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and the kind of suburban tranquility that real estate agents describe as family-friendly community living. What they don't mention in the brochures is that some HOA neighborhoods operate less like communities and more like criminal enterprises with better landscaping. I should have known something was off when I met Karen Blackwood during my first week. She appeared at my door like a blonde tornado wrapped in a Chanel suit, carrying a clipboard thick enough to contain the entire municipal code and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she'd been practicing it in a mirror for maximum intimidation effect. "Welcome to Willowbrook," she announced, not waiting for me to actually welcome her onto my property. "I'm Karen Blackwood, HOA President, Community Standards Coordinator, and Neighborhood Improvement Specialist. I'm here to help you understand our community guidelines." She pushed past me into my foyer with the confidence of someone who'd clearly never heard the word no applied to her personal ambitions. Behind her followed two men who looked like they'd been recruited from a catalog titled Discount Security Guards for Suburban Dictators. "These are my community enforcement officers," Karen said, gesturing to her companions. "Mike and Steve help ensure our neighborhood standards are properly maintained." Mike and Steve nodded gravely, like community enforcement was serious business requiring tactical expertise and probably advanced training in mailbox alignment. They wore matching polo shirts with WBHOA Security embroidered on the chest and carried clipboards that looked official enough to fool anyone who didn't examine them too closely. "Now," Karen continued, settling herself on my couch without invitation, "let's discuss your property compliance requirements." For the next 45 minutes, Karen outlined a list of regulations that would have made a maximum security prison warden proud. Grass height specifications measured to the quarter inch. Paint color requirements that included approved shade variations. Garbage can placement rules that apparently required geometric precision and possibly a degree in municipal engineering. "Your lawn is currently 2.3 inches tall," she announced, consulting her clipboard like she was delivering a medical diagnosis. "Community standard is 2.0 inches maximum. That's a $150 fine, payable immediately." I looked out my window at what appeared to be a perfectly normal suburban lawn. "You measured my grass?" "Community standards require constant vigilance," Karen replied, as if grass surveillance was a perfectly reasonable way to spend one's time. "Mike and Steve conduct daily inspections to ensure compliance." Mike and Steve nodded again, apparently proud of their careers in lawn enforcement and mailbox monitoring. "Also," Karen continued, "your welcome mat is positioned 3.2 inches from the door threshold. Community standard is 3.0 inches exactly. Another $150 fine." I stared at Karen, processing the fact that someone had apparently measured the distance between my door and a piece of carpet with the precision usually reserved for NASA missions. "You measured my welcome mat?" "Attention to detail creates community excellence," she replied, writing something on her clipboard that probably involved more fines for things I didn't know were measurable offenses. Over the following weeks, I learned that Karen's version of community excellence involved a level of micromanagement that would have made totalitarian regimes jealous. Every morning, Mike and Steve patrolled the neighborhood like suburban stormtroopers, documenting violations with the enthusiasm of people who'd found their lives calling and harassing homeowners about decorative mulch placement. The fines arrived daily. $100 for parking my car 6.7 inches from the curb instead of the regulation's 6.0 inches. $200 for having a garden gnome that apparently violated the decorative consistency standards. $300 for the criminal offense of hanging Christmas lights in November instead of December, which Karen claimed disrupted this seasonal aesthetic harmony. But the real education came from my neighbors, who approached me with the cautious demeanor of people sharing state secrets in a surveillance state. "Don't pay the fines," whispered Mrs. Patterson from next door, glancing around like Karen's enforcement officers might be hiding in the bushes. That's what they want you to think you have to do, but it's all a scam. What kind of scam? Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, her voice dropping to the kind of whisper usually reserved for discussing classified information. They target new residents, pile on impossible fines, and when you can't pay, they offer to resolve the situation by buying your house at below market value. It's happened to 3 families this year. That's illegal. Of course it's illegal. But Mike and Steve aren't real cops. The fines aren't real legal documents. And Karen isn't a real authority figure. They're just very good at making people think they are. That evening, Mr. Rodriguez from across the street knocked on my door, looking around nervously before stepping inside. Karen's been asking questions about you, he said. Specifically about when you leave for work, whether you travel, if you have security systems. Why would she want to know that? Because that's how they do the final push, Rodriguez explained. When someone won't cooperate, they break in and plant something, drugs, stolen goods, whatever. Then they conduct an emergency inspection, find the evidence, and offer to make the whole thing disappear if you sell them your house cheap. I stared at Rodriguez, processing this information. They frame people. It's brilliant, really. Who's going to believe that the HOA president and her security team are running a property theft scheme? They look official, they have badges and clipboards, and most people just assume they have legitimate authority. That night, I did some research on Willowbrook Estates property sales over the past 2 years. The pattern was obvious once you knew what to look for. New residents would move in, face escalating HOA harassment, then suddenly sell their homes to WB Community Development LLC at prices significantly below market value. WB Community Development LLC was registered to 1K, Blackwood. Karen wasn't just an entitled HOA president. She was running an elaborate real estate fraud scheme, using fake authority and intimidation to steal houses from people who didn't know their rights. And judging by the success rate, it had been working beautifully. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my door. Final warning. Community compliance required. It informed me that I had accumulated $3,247 in violations and faced immediate, enhanced enforcement procedures if the fines weren't paid within 48 hours. Enhanced enforcement procedures. That sounded ominous enough to suggest that Karen was moving into the next phase of her property acquisition strategy. I looked at my house. A beautiful colonial with mature oak trees, a corner lot, and probably $150,000 more in market value than Karen's previous victims had received. No wonder she'd targeted me with such enthusiasm. My property wasn't just a house, it was Karen's retirement fund. But Karen Blackwood had made one critical miscalculation in her criminal career planning. She'd assumed I was just another suburban homeowner who would fold under pressure from fake authority figures. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 3 years as a military police officer before my civilian career, which meant I actually knew the difference between real law enforcement and theatrical intimidation. And more importantly, I had a very specific set of skills when it came to dealing with people who thought they could steal from me. Karen wanted to play games with fake cops and planted evidence? Fine. But she was about to learn that some games have much higher stakes than she'd bargained for. The morning after Karen's final warning, I decided it was time to take a more proactive approach to neighborhood intelligence gathering. I started with coffee at the local diner, where longtime residents seemed more willing to discuss the Blackwood crime syndicate without looking over their shoulders every 30 seconds. Been going on for about 3 years now, confirmed Earl, a retiree who'd apparently witnessed Karen's entire criminal evolution. Started with normal HOA power trips. You know, complaining about grass height and mailbox colors. But then people started noticing the same pattern. New residents, escalating harassment, mysterious house sales. What about the police? Hasn't anyone reported this? Earl laughed bitterly. Mike and Steve look official enough that most people assume they are police. They've got badges, uniforms, the whole setup. Karen's smart. She targets people who don't know any better, and by the time they figure out it's a scam, they're too embarrassed to admit they got fooled. Over the next week, I collected enough information to write a criminal conspiracy manual. Karen's operation was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. She'd created an entire fake bureaucracy, complete with official-looking documents, manufactured legal authority, and a systematic process for identifying and targeting vulnerable homeowners. The pattern was always the same: excessive fines, impossible compliance requirements, fake legal threats, and finally the break-in and plant evidence finale that gave Karen maximum leverage for her below-market property offers. She'd refined the process into a reliable income stream that had netted her at least 7 properties in 3 years. But Karen's success had made her overconfident, and overconfident criminals make mistakes. According to my surveillance of her operation, she was already moving into position for the final phase of my property acquisition. Mike and Steve had started conducting security patrols past my house every few hours, taking pictures and making notes about my schedule. Karen herself had begun asking neighbors casual questions about my work schedule, travel plans, and whether I lived alone. All classic pre-crime intelligence gathering that would have been obvious to anyone with actual law enforcement training. That's when I decided to recruit my secret weapon, Samson, my 6-foot ball python. I'd acquired Samson during my military days from a fellow MP who was getting transferred overseas. Ball pythons are generally docile, non-venomous, and completely harmless to humans, but they look absolutely terrifying to anyone who isn't familiar with reptile behavior. More importantly, Samson had been trained to respond to specific commands and could be relied upon to stay exactly where I placed him until instructed otherwise. The plan that formed in my mind was beautifully simple. Let Karen and her fake cops break into my house, then trap them inside with 6 feet of seemingly dangerous snake while I called the real police. It would be impossible for them to explain their presence in my home at 3 a.m., and their panicked reaction to Samson would be captured on the security system I was about to install. I spent the next few days setting up my trap with the precision of someone who'd actually studied criminal interdiction techniques. Motion-activated cameras in every room, infrared sensors that would trigger automatic recording, and a sophisticated door lock system that could be controlled remotely from my phone. The centerpiece of the operation was Samson's positioning. I created a comfortable hiding spot for him inside a decorative chest near my front door, with a remote-controlled opening mechanism that would release him exactly where I wanted him. To anyone breaking into the house, it would appear that a massive snake had somehow materialized to block their escape route. Meanwhile, Karen's harassment campaign reached new levels of creative desperation. The fines had escalated to include violations I was fairly certain she was inventing in real time. Unapproved seasonal doormat transition protocols, $500. Non-compliance with community atmospheric harmony standards, $750. And my personal favorite, failure to maintain regulation-appropriate lawn energy frequencies, $1,200. The final notice arrived on a Tuesday. Emergency compliance inspection scheduled. It informed me that due to my continued violations of community safety standards, Mike and Steve would be conducting a mandatory property inspection within 48 hours to ensure neighborhood security protocols. The notice was signed with Karen's flourished signature and included an official-looking seal that probably came from an office supply store's Make Your Own Authority section. It also mentioned that the inspection would occur at a time convenient for enforcement efficiency, which in criminal speak meant when you're not home to interfere. That evening, I had a conversation with Samson about his upcoming starring role in community law enforcement. "Okay, buddy," I said, offering him his favorite treat. "Tomorrow night you get to be a crime-fighting python. Just lie where I put you, look intimidating, and don't actually hurt anyone. We want them scared, not injured." Samson regarded me with the kind of patient expression that suggested he understood the assignment and was professionally prepared to execute it with appropriate reptilian dignity. The next morning, I made a big show of loading luggage into my car and telling my neighbor Mrs. Patterson that I'd be out of town for a few days visiting family. Within an hour, I spotted Mike conducting surveillance from his car, undoubtedly confirming that the target was away and the house was ready for their special brand of evidence planting. I parked 2 blocks away in a 24-hour diner parking lot with a clear view of my street, settled in with coffee and binoculars, and activated my security system's remote monitoring. Every camera was recording, every motion sensor was armed, and Samson was positioned in his hiding spot, like a coiled reptilian surprise waiting for Karen's fake cops to spring their own trap. By 2:30 a.m., I could see Mike and Steve's car creeping down my street with their headlights off, moving with the kind of theatrical stealth that suggested they'd learned criminal technique from watching too many bad movies. They parked 3 houses away and approached my front door with a collection of tools that looked suspiciously like professional burglary equipment. So much for the pretense of official HOA business. They were just common criminals with better costumes. Through my phone's security app, I watched them pick my front door lock with practiced efficiency, then slip inside my house like they'd done this dozens of times before. Which, judging by their success rate, they probably had. Time for Phase 2 of Operation Python Surprise. I activated Samson's release mechanism and watched through my cameras as 6 feet of ball python slithered out of his hiding spot and positioned himself directly in front of the door they just used to break into my house. Then I called 911, because watching 2 fake cops discover they were trapped in a house with what appeared to be a massive snake was about to become the most entertaining criminal justice moment of my entire life. 911, what's your emergency? Hi, I'd like to report a break-in in progress at my home, I said, watching Mike and Steve through my security cameras as they crept through my living room with flashlights and what appeared to be a bag of planting materials. 2 men just broke into my house, and I think they're trying to plant evidence. Sir, are you currently at the location? No, I'm about 2 blocks away. I had reason to believe this was going to happen, so I set up surveillance and called as soon as they entered illegally. There was a pause that suggested the dispatcher was trying to process a situation that didn't fit the normal emergency call script. You anticipated that someone would break into your house. It's complicated. Just send officers to 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. There are currently 2 intruders inside, and they're about to have a very bad night. Through my phone screen, I could see Mike and Steve moving methodically through my house, examining rooms and apparently looking for the best place to hide whatever they'd brought to incriminate me. They moved with the confidence of people who'd done this before and expected to be gone long before anyone discovered their presence. That's when they decided to head back toward the front door, probably having completed their evidence planting mission. I zoomed in on the security feed, not wanting to miss the exact moment when they discovered that their exit strategy had developed a significant reptilian complication. Mike reached the front door first, fumbling with the lock mechanism in the dark. Steve was right behind him, probably eager to complete their criminal mission and get back to whatever fake security guards do when they're not committing breaking and entering. The front door opened, and Mike stepped forward into what he expected to be clear passage to freedom and continued criminal success. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with 6 feet of ball python coiled peacefully across the doorway like a living, breathing security system with scales and attitude. The sound Mike made was somewhere between a scream, a yelp, and the noise someone might make if they'd just discovered their worst nightmare had materialized between them and their only exit. He jumped backwards so fast that he crashed into Steve, who was still trying to figure out why his partner had suddenly launched himself into reverse. "What the hell?" Steve started to say, then looked down and saw Samson regarding them both with the kind of patient interest that ball pythons reserve for situations that might require their attention but don't necessarily call for immediate action. Steve's reaction was even better than Mike's. He screamed like someone who'd just discovered that their fake law enforcement career had taken an unexpected turn into wildlife management, then jumped onto my couch with the agility of someone whose fear response had temporarily overridden basic physics. "Get it away from the door," Mike shouted, scrambling to join Steve on the furniture like 2 grown men who'd just discovered that criminal enterprises sometimes involve occupational hazards they hadn't considered during career planning. Samson, for his part, remained exactly where I'd positioned him, blocking the door with the professional dedication of a reptile who understood his assignment and was prepared to execute it with appropriate python dignity. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't making any threatening moves, just lying there being impressively large and snake-like in exactly the right location. Through my security cameras, I could see both men pressed against the back of my couch, staring at Samson like he was a dragon guarding a treasure hoard rather than a docile pet python, doing his job as a temporary security system. "How did a snake get in here?" Steve whispered, apparently trying not to attract Samson's attention through excessive volume. "I don't know," Mike hissed back. "Maybe it lives here. Maybe the guy's some kind of snake person." Snake person. I made a mental note to add that to my resume under special skills. Experienced snake person with expertise in criminal deterrence through reptilian deployment. "We have to get past it," Steve said, eyeing the door like he was planning some sort of military maneuver around a python roadblock. "You get past it," Mike replied. "I'm not going anywhere near that thing. We can't stay here. The cops might come." If only they knew that the cops were already on their way, and their current reptilian predicament was about to become the least of their legal problems. I grabbed my binoculars and watched the street, waiting for the arrival of actual law enforcement officers who were about to witness what might be the most unusual crime scene of their careers. Two fake security guards trapped by a python while attempting to commit breaking and entering would probably make the department's stories we'll never believe, but have to write reports about Hall of Fame. 5 minutes later, I saw the patrol car turn onto my street, followed by a second unit and what appeared to be a supervisor's vehicle. Apparently, break-in with possible evidence planting involving anticipated reptilian complications had generated enough interest to warrant multiple officers. I started walking toward my house, arriving just as the officers were getting out of their cars and trying to figure out why there was a woman in a Chanel suit standing at my front door, looking agitated and checking her phone every few seconds. Karen Blackwood had apparently decided to personally supervise the final phase of her property acquisition scheme, which meant she was about to become an eyewitness to her own criminal operation's spectacular failure. "Ma'am, please step back from the residence," Officer Johnson called out as he approached. "We've received reports of a break-in." Karen turned toward the officers with the kind of confident smile that suggested she was prepared to explain why she had legitimate business at my house at 3:17 a.m. "Officers, I'm Karen Blackwood, HOA president. I was conducting a routine security check and noticed unusual activity. At 3 in the morning? Community safety requires vigilance at all hours," Karen replied, apparently sticking to her script despite the fact that actual police officers tend to be less impressed by fake authority than intimidated homeowners. That's when we all heard the screaming from inside my house. "Help! We're trapped by a snake," came Mike's voice through the front door, followed by what sounded like furniture being rearranged by people trying to get as far away from the floor as possible. Officer Johnson looked at me, then at Karen, then at the front door where muffled shouting was coming from two grown men who appeared to be having some sort of reptilian crisis. "That would be the break-in," I said helpfully, pulling out my keys. "The two guys inside are the ones who picked my lock about 20 minutes ago. I can let you in, but you should probably know about Samson." "Samson? My ball python. He's currently providing perimeter security." Officer Johnson stared at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized that his Tuesday night shift was about to become significantly more interesting than usual. Officer Johnson approached my front door with the cautious professionalism of someone who'd just learned that the evening's criminal investigation involved reptilian security systems and suspects who were apparently being held hostage by a snake. Behind him, Officers Williams and Rodriguez flanked Karen, who was starting to look less like a confident HOA president and more like someone who'd just realized her criminal empire was about to collapse in the most embarrassing way possible. "Sir, you said you anticipated this break-in?" Johnson asked, fitting his key into my lock. "How exactly did you know this was going to happen?" "It's been building for weeks," I explained, watching Karen's confident facade crumble in real time. "Fake fines, fraudulent legal threats, and surveillance of my daily schedule. Classic pre-crime behavior from people running a property theft scheme." "Property theft scheme?" "I can explain everything once we get inside and deal with the snake situation," I said, turning the key and slowly opening the front door. "Just so you know, Samson is completely harmless, but he's very good at staying exactly where I put him. The door swung open to reveal Mike and Steve still standing on my couch like two grown men who decided that furniture was their natural habitat. Samson remained coiled peacefully in front of the doorway, blocking their escape with the professional dedication of a reptile who understood his job description and took it seriously. "Oh my God," whispered Officer Williams, staring at the scene. "Is that really a python?" "Ball python," I corrected. "About 6 feet, completely non-venomous, and currently providing citizens arrest assistance." Officer Rodriguez started laughing before he could stop himself. "This is definitely going in the report," he said, pulling out his phone to document what was probably the most unusual crime scene of his career. 2 suspects detained by reptilian security system. Mike and Steve looked up from their couch refuge with expressions of relief, mixed with the kind of embarrassment that comes from being rescued from a snake that was never actually dangerous to them. "Officers, thank God you're here," Mike said, carefully climbing down from the furniture while keeping a wary eye on Samson. "We were conducting a routine HOA inspection when this creature appeared." "At 3 in the morning?" Johnson asked, his tone suggesting that Mike's explanation needed significant improvement. "Emergency compliance inspection," Steve added helpfully, apparently sticking to their script despite the fact that actual police officers tend to notice when stories don't make sense. "We had reports of dangerous violations." "Reports from who?" Both men looked toward Karen, who was standing in my doorway with the expression of someone who'd just watched her carefully constructed criminal enterprise collapse into a comedy show starring her own fake employees. "Actually," I said, walking over to Samson and gently coaxing him away from the door, "before we get into the HOA inspection story, you might want to see what they brought with them." I pointed to the bag that Mike had dropped when he'd encountered his reptilian roadblock. Officer Johnson opened it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a substantial quantity of marijuana, some pills that looked suspiciously like controlled substances, and a collection of items that could charitably be described as burglary tools and more accurately described as evidence-planting supplies. "Interesting inspection equipment," Johnson observed, examining the contents. "Do you always bring dugs and lockpicks to HOA compliance checks?" "Those aren't ours," Mike protested, apparently forgetting that he'd been carrying the bag when he broke into my house. "Someone must have planted them." Officer Rodriguez couldn't control his laughter anymore. "Someone planted dugs on the people who broke in to plant dugs? That's either brilliant irony or the worst criminal defense strategy I've ever heard." While the officers were processing Mike and Steve's creative explanation for their presence, I pulled up my security footage on my phone and showed Officer Johnson the complete timeline of the evening's criminal activities. "Here's them picking my front door lock at 2:47 a.m., I said, scrolling through the video. "Here's them moving through my house with flashlights and the evidence bag. And here's the moment they met Samson and discovered that their exit strategy had developed reptilian complications." Johnson watched the footage with the professional interest of someone who was seeing a perfectly documented case of breaking and entering, complete with criminal intent and the most unusual suspect detention method in law enforcement history. "And you anticipated this how?" "Because it's their standard operating procedure," I explained, glancing at Karen, who was looking increasingly pale as she realized how much I knew about her operation. "Escalating fake fines, impossible compliance requirements, and finally breaking into plant evidence that gives them leverage to force below-market property sales." "That's ridiculous," Karen interjected, trying to reclaim control of a situation that was spiraling far beyond her criminal comfort zone. "These men are legitimate HOA enforcement officers conducting authorized inspections." "Authorized by who?" Officer Williams asked. "And why would authorized inspections require breaking and entering with dugs and burglary tools?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, apparently realizing that her usual confident explanations weren't going to work on actual law enforcement officers who understood the difference between real authority and theatrical intimidation. "Ma'am," Johnson said, pulling out his handcuffs, "I'm going to need you to step over here while we sort this out." That's when Karen made her final mistake. Instead of cooperating or trying to lawyer her way out of the situation, she decided to run. She bolted from my front door with the panicked desperation of someone who'd just realized that 3 years of successful property theft had come to an abrupt and embarrassing end. Unfortunately for Karen, her escape plan didn't account for the fact that she was wearing designer heels on a suburban street at 3:30 a.m., while being pursued by officers who'd trained for exactly this kind of situation. She made it approximately 30 feet before Officer Rodriguez tackled her into Mrs. Patterson's prize-winning rose bushes, which added the perfect finishing touch to her criminal career finale. Nothing says fallen crime boss quite like being arrested in a flower bed while wearing a Chanel suit and trying to explain why you were supervising a burglary operation at 3 in the morning. As Karen was being read her rights, Mike and Steve sat in the back of separate patrol cars, still stealing glances at Samson, who had returned to his normal docile demeanor and was currently accepting treats from Officer Williams like the hero he was. "I have to ask," Johnson said, closing his notebook after taking my statement. "How did you train a python to block doors on command?" "Military police background," I explained, scratching behind Samson's head. "You'd be surprised what you can accomplish with proper planning and a well-trained snake." "This is definitely going in the department newsletter," Rodriguez called from where he was loading Karen into his patrol car. Headline: Local Python Assists in Major Property Fraud Bust. As the patrol cars pulled away with their cargo of failed criminals, I looked at my house, my heroic snake, and the scattered remains of what had been Karen Blackwood's suburban criminal empire. Sometimes justice comes from the courts, sometimes it comes from community action, and sometimes it comes from a 6-foot ball python with perfect timing and an excellent understanding of perimeter security. The investigation that followed was everything I'd hoped for and more. Within 48 hours, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had taken over the case, apparently fascinated by the scope and sophistication of Karen's property theft operation. What started as a simple breaking and entering had unveiled a 3-year criminal enterprise that made Karen Blackwood one of the most successful suburban crime bosses in Colorado history. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen's computer contained detailed files on every targeted homeowner, including surveillance photos, financial backgrounds, and strategic plans for each property acquisition. She'd documented her entire operation with the thoroughness of someone who'd apparently considered writing a criminal instruction manual. Mike and Steve, faced with federal charges and the prospect of spending the next decade in prison, became enthusiastically cooperative witnesses. Their testimony revealed the full extent of Karen's operation: 17 successful property thefts, over $2.3 million in fraudulent acquisitions, and a network of accomplices that included fake inspectors, corrupt contractors, and a lawyer who'd been helping Karen create fraudulent legal documents. The fake HOA enforcement operation was just the beginning. Karen had been running parallel scams involving emergency repairs that damaged properties to justify forced sales, community improvement assessments that were actually extortion payments, and a sophisticated money laundering operation that funneled stolen property profits through her various shell companies. But the best part of the investigation was watching Karen's confident facade crumble as federal investigators unraveled every aspect of her criminal empire. The woman who'd spent 3 years terrorizing homeowners with fake authority was reduced to hiring the most expensive defense attorney in Denver to explain why she'd been caught supervising a burglary while her employees were trapped by a python. The local media coverage was everything I'd hoped for and more. HOA crime boss caught in snake trap made the front page of 3 newspapers, while Python hero foils property theft ring became the most watched local news story of the year. Samson became a minor celebrity, with interview requests from animal shows and what appeared to be an offer to appear in a documentary about unusual crime-fighting techniques. The courtroom proceedings were even more entertaining than the media coverage. Karen's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was simply an overzealous HOA president whose community improvement efforts had been misunderstood by vindictive homeowners. This argument lasted exactly until the prosecutor showed the jury Karen's computer files, which included detailed plans for property theft victim surveillance schedules, and what could only be described as a criminal instruction manual for suburban property fraud. Mike and Steve received 8-year sentences for their roles as Karen's enforcement officers, while the various accomplices received terms ranging from 2 to 6 years, depending on their level of involvement. The corrupt lawyer was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, which probably gave him plenty of time to reconsider his career choice to help suburban crime bosses with their legal documentation needs. Karen herself received the maximum sentence: 15 years in federal prison for racketeering, property theft, fraud, and leading a criminal enterprise. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted that Karen's operation had shown remarkable creativity in criminal enterprise development, but had ultimately failed due to poor victim selection and inadequate operational security protocols. The property restitution phase was equally satisfying. Every house that Karen had stolen through her fake HOA scheme was returned to its original owners or their heirs, while Karen's legitimate assets were liquidated to compensate victims for their losses. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was dissolved and reformed under federal oversight, with new bylaws that specifically prohibited enforcement activities by anyone without legitimate legal authority. My house, which had been Karen's ultimate target, became something of a neighborhood landmark. Mrs. Patterson started giving tours to visitors who wanted to see the scene where the python caught the criminals, while Mr. Rodriguez created a small memorial garden dedicated to Samson, the crime-fighting snake, in his front yard. The real satisfaction, though, came from the community transformation. Without Karen's reign of terror, Willowbrook Estates became the kind of neighborhood it had always been advertised as: friendly, peaceful, and full of people who actually cared about each other rather than property values and mailbox regulations. The new HOA board consists of actual homeowners who understand that community guidelines should serve residents rather than enrich criminal enterprises. The monthly meetings focus on legitimate community issues like road maintenance and park improvements, rather than manufactured violations and intimidation tactics. Samson retired from law enforcement with full honors, and now spends his days accepting treats from neighbors who consider him a local hero. He's got his own social media account, managed by Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, and receives fan mail from python enthusiasts and crime victims across the country. As for me, I finally got to enjoy the peaceful suburban life I'd originally sought. My grass grows to whatever height seems reasonable, my welcome mat sits wherever I want to place it, and my mailbox remains cheerfully non-regulation without generating any fake legal documents or surveillance operations. Every morning, I have my coffee on the front porch and reflect on the fact that sometimes the best defense against entitled criminals is patience, preparation, and a well-trained snake with excellent timing. Karen Blackwood spent 3 years building a criminal empire based on fake authority and intimidation tactics. But it all came crashing down because she underestimated a homeowner who knew the difference between real law enforcement and suburban theater. The final touch came 6 months later, when I received a letter from the Colorado Department of Corrections. Karen had requested permission to start a prison garden club, apparently having discovered a newfound interest in legitimate horticulture. Her request was denied when officials learned that her previous community involvement had resulted in federal racketeering charges and a python-related arrest. Sometimes justice is swift, sometimes it's poetic, and sometimes it involves a 6-foot ball python with perfect comedic timing. In Karen Blackwood's case, it was all three, with the added bonus of federal prison time and a criminal legacy that would probably be taught in law enforcement academies as an example of how suburban crime schemes can collapse spectacularly when they encounter proper preparation and reptilian assistance. The neighborhood is quiet now, the way suburban communities are supposed to be. And if any future entitled criminals want to try their luck with fake authority and property theft schemes, they'll have to get past Samson first. Good luck with that. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.